So welcome everyone to the webinar on new tools for transparency verification and confidence building. My name is Nikolai Sokov. I work at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, and I will moderate this seminar. This is the last seminar of the series that explores the impact of new and emerging technologies on deterrence. The previous seminars, the previous 5 seminars were mostly addressing the negative impact of new technologies. Well, some consequences of new technologies were positive and good, but mostly they decreased predictability. They made deterrence less kind of stable. They introduced new variables that made it more complicated for states to assess the stability of deterrence. This seminar will actually look at the impact of new technologies that are mostly positive, that enhance the ability of states to verify agreements, that enhance transparency, and that allow to do more in confidence building among states. As we contemplate the impact of new technologies, it's important to understand that transparency, the availability of information is quite important for the stability of deterrence. To a large extent, instability comes from doubt. Instability comes from the lack of data about intentions and capabilities of states. Well, intentions are always difficult to verify, but capabilities you can verify, just as long as you have the right tools to do that. So in a sense, the more you know about the other side, the more certain you are that the other side does not intend to attack you, or that you have sufficient capability, for example, to respond to the attack. Similarly, if you know enough about the other side, you can know that attacking the other side is not a good idea. So the availability of information can enhance the stability of the strength of deterrence. New tools within verification are also vital for arms control. Yes, we will see from presentations today that you can, in fact, now verify the aspects, the elements of military capabilities that in the past were not considered verifiable. In my previous life, when I worked at the foreign ministries of the Soviet Union and then Russia, I did participate in START 1 talks, some other negotiations, mostly actually dealt with verification issues. And I know how difficult it was to negotiate verification rules for some elements of strategic capabilities. Now we have more tools, so now we can verify more, and now we can actually engage in arms control more. We can tackle new issues, and that's very good. Moreover, we can now seriously begin thinking about verifying nuclear disarmament. The goal that 15, 20, 30 years ago was not really very thinkable. Finally, historically, verification and transparency were really kind of the monopoly of a handful of states. that were most advanced technologically. New technologies and new tools now can help empower a lot more states. Almost every state in the world can now do that to some extent. Moreover, not just states, but also the civil society. All these developments, all this empowerment has resulted from new technologies. And today's today's seminar will address these aspects. We have I'm sorry. Some household announcements. First of all, just to remind you that the webinar will be recorded. I will also would like to note that those who join through Zoom, please submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. Please do not use the chat function for that. Just the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. For those of you who join through live stream on YouTube, please submit your questions via email to events at VCDNP.org. So yes, these are important announcements. So the stellar panel today, people who do work on these new technologies, people who open new horizons in their daily work. The first speaker will be Dr. Alexander Graef from the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy. Please, the floor is yours, Alex.
Thank you, Nikolai. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for this kind introduction. Let me just share my screen with the presentation. I would like to use the next 10 minutes or so to talk about the Open Skies Treaty, or more generally speaking, cooperative aerial observation within the context of the Open Skies Treaty. For those who, I'm sorry, this is not the right slide. I have to go to the first one. For those who don't know, the Open Skies Treaty, the idea for the treaty stems from the 1950s. And the treaty, as we know today, has been signed first in 1992, and it has been enforced since 2002. And since 2005, so for the last 15 years, we had 34 state parties. Now it's only 33, and soon it will be 32. And since that time, we had about 100 flights every year, and 1,500 flights in total. And 1/3 of these flights, however, went over Belarus and Russia, which gives you a hint about how these flights are distributed, since NATO members do not conduct flights over each other. The treaty, more generally speaking, allows you to conduct unarmed observation flights over the entire territory of the participating states. And I think this is very important to recognize that there's, in a way, unlimited access to the sovereign territory of the member states. Unfortunately, as you probably know, over the last years, there have been some problems with the treaty. There were no flights in 2018. There has been a reduced number of flights last year due to the corona regulations, and the United States withdrew from the treaty last year, and Russia will follow in December this year. Nonetheless, when we look back at the treaty as it has been used and is hopefully going to be used in the future, one central element, of course, is that it creates transparency among a rather large group of states. And the central element here is, of course, the kind of sensor types that are used within these aircraft, which all have a standardized resolution based on the treaty, which varies from or by sensor type. So for electro-optical sensors, there's 30 centimeters, and for infrared is 50. For radar, it's 300. Although I must add that the radar has not been in use within the treaty. The same goes for infrared until very recently. 3 points here to mention in terms of how we can use these sensors within the treaty. One is that the resolution, of course, varies with the flight altitude. So the member states have taken a lot of effort actually to define the lowest possible altitude that is, well, possible without exceeding the maximum resolution. As you can see here in this picture, also the SWAT varies with flight altitude. So the coverage of territory actually depends on the altitude of the aircraft. And the last part is about the range of the aircraft. If you fly at low altitudes, you will use more fuel, and so their range will be shorter. So these three dimensions, if you want, define how actually one could use these sensors on these aircraft to make things transparent and to conduct missions over member states. How does this help us in terms of transparency? Well, this level of resolution of 30 centimeters allows you basically to generally and precisely identify military equipment, but also military infrastructure, not only military, but also industrial infrastructure, of course. And the main reason why there is this limitation also of 30 centimeters has one to do with considerations of security, of course, also back then, the late 80s in the Soviet Union, but also because the treaty as such was first imagined as an element for the CFE treaty to actually do verification for the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe. One additional point here that is important is that all the technology, the cameras, is off-the-shelf technology. That is, it's not specially made or military equipment, but it's technology that is available on the market. And this, of course, has an impact on how this treaty functions and what kind of benefits it brings. Because the second part, apart from transparency, of course, is confidence building. As I said, there are more than 30 member states to the treaty. And in the past, this meant that there has been a high degree of cooperation. There have been joint certifications of the cameras in use, of the aircraft in use. There have been joint flight teams, also because not all states actually own aircraft that are certified for use under the treaty. As you can see here, a cooperation between two parties in an aircraft, and all the images that are available through the Open Skies framework are actually available to all state parties at nominal costs. So first for the observer state, for the observing state, but also to all other member states if they pay the price for reproduction. And last but not least, the treaty guarantees the authenticity of images because the process is in a way tamper-proof. And as you can also see on this picture here on the right side, these sensors are inspected before takeoff. And again, this is of course also the ability of states to check whether only the sensors are there that have or should be there according to the treaty. But this is not all to it. So for many years, the Open Skies Treaty or the members of the treaty have been using panchromatic wet film. But for about 15 years, since there has been a problem with the production lines for wet film, the informal working group on sensors within the treaty has been thinking about how to actually modernize these sensors and to get digitalization going. And this was quite a tricky process because one of the main challenges, of course, has been how to make sure that there is no post-image improvement of the resolution of these images. And this is, of course, much more difficult to do in the digital age than it is with panchromatic wet film. There were some other challenges. You had to define the bands of the different possible imagery. You had to define the technology for multispectral imagery, and also do the nitty-gritty of how to actually do the visual analysis, what kind of digital file format to use, etc. And that took quite some time, 7 years to be exact. And in September 2013, there was a first certification attempt for a Russian digital aerial camera, the OSD Cam 4060. And this was the first time this was done, almost successfully, because there has been a point of contention between the Russian Federation and the United States at that point, and there was some delay, but the issue could be solved, which had to do, in fact, with this issue of post-imagery improvement. But in May 2014, the United States approved the certification, and since then, Russia has been the first and only state, in fact, to use digital cameras within the framework of the treaty. So a brief look at this Russian camera. Here you see a picture of it. It's a multi-lenses framing camera. And in addition to the panchromatic version that was in use before, there's also an AGB channel and a near-infrared channel. And the first use, at least over the United States and Canada, was in 2016. And it has been used on all three types of aircraft that Russia has been using under the treaty. Unfortunately, as I said at the beginning, Russia is going to leave the treaty this year. And the only state right now that has a new aircraft with a new digital sensor set is Germany, but the aircraft has not yet been certified, which probably will happen in the end of next year. What could be the future of the use of open skies, looking beyond the use for military purposes? And in fact, ever since the treaty was signed in 1992, there have been discussions about additional uses, non-military uses, for example, for disaster relief, but also for environmental purposes. As you can see here on the left side, two pictures, one from Haiti, from Germany. The United States used its own capabilities, open skies capabilities, for the Haiti earthquake. And in fact, in 5 hours, the aircraft was overflying an area of, I think, 20,000 square kilometers, so a quarter of Austria, if you want. And this information then helped to improve disaster relief. There's a similar situation you have with the European floods in Germany, where Germany used its new aircraft, which is not yet certified under the treaty, but it used it for taking pictures of the floods in Germany there, and also got new information via this equipment. And so one could actually imagine to use open skies equipment for different purposes, not only in severe weather situations, but also when you think about environmental contamination. And the main issue here, or the main value added, could be non-imaging sensors, because that would be also an advantage when compared to satellite imagery. For example, if within the Open Skies Treaty or in another aerial observation regime, one would use non-imaging sensors, for example, to take air samples, then of course it would be possible to use them to detect contamination of the air and of the environment. I will leave it here. Thank you very much. And of course, I'm open for any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Alex. And just look on my side, I would actually I like to emphasize that more states now can jointly use this equipment, both for confidence building purposes and other kind of purposes. And I really welcome that very much personally, because we'll introduce more kind of democratic, I would say, actually, on nature to the traditional fields, Belarus control, verification, and transparency. The next speaker is Veronika Bedenko, who works as an analyst in the Open Nuclear Network, which is the program based here in Vienna and part of One Earth Future. And now, Veronika, please, the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much, Nikolai, for your kind introduction. Just give me 1 second to share my screen. Okay, so first of all, I want to just say good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you join us from. It's my great pleasure to be joining this panel today and to share this virtual floor with such distinguished speakers. So in this webinar series, we're talking about new tools and technology that is shaping the security environment today. So I decided to focus my presentation on the subject that I'm closely working on, namely the use of open source data analysis and how open source data is helping to make the field of verification accessible to a wider audience, while before it was only available to a handful of advanced countries, as Nikolai put it before. So during the next 10 minutes, I want to quickly walk you through the concept of open source data and open source intelligence, OSINT, and give you a snapshot of what capabilities are now available to the general public. With that, let's just jump right into it. So I wanted to start with quite a provocative quote from a former director of the US Defense Intelligence Agency, Samuel Wilson, who stated that 90% of all the intelligence that the intelligence agencies compile come from open source. In essence, this means that 90% of what intelligence agencies know is available to us, the general public, who do not have security clearance and access to any classified information. And this is a very shocking number. So what do we mean when we talk about open source information? According to the US government, open source information or open source data is a publicly available material that anyone can lawfully obtain by request, purchase, or observation. It is important to note that open source data has little individual value on its own. What is important are the insights that one can draw from the data, and that's what we call open source intelligence or OSINT. To give you a specific example, a single Twitter tweet reflecting a random user's view on, for example, ISIS is of almost no intelligence value. However, if one could synthesize all the tweets on views on ISIS within a specific geographic area, this information would be of a great intelligence value. But let's get back to what information we actually call open source. On this slide, I try to present the categories of data that are considered open source. Geospatial data, media, the content generated by users on social media, databases and archives. So these are the classical examples of open source data, and I'm sure you're using them almost every day. There is also data which can be accessed by the general public, but it constitutes somewhat a gray area of open source domain. And here I'm talking about the compromised or leaked data. So think if somebody hacked your account and then leaked the data out in the internet, so it became available to the general public, but it wasn't really lawfully obtained in the first place, as we saw in the definition. So this is still a great area. But so how is this all relevant to the verification efforts? Well, I understand verification in its broader meaning here as a process of establishing the truth, accuracy, or validity of something. So through using data available in the open source domain, we can try to establish the authenticity of the data point in question. In other words, perform verification of this data. The open source data analysis, including for verification purposes, is used by a constantly increasing number of organizations. But just to give you a couple of examples, you've probably heard of the Bellingcat, a company of investigative journalists that specializes in fact-checking in open source intelligence. and how they were able to prove presence of Russian troops in Ukraine, or, you know, you name it. They have a number of really well-known investigations. To bring examples closer to our field, so the International Atomic Energy Agency has its open source data analytical team. The United Nations is using open source data to produce its reports. And here you can think about the reports of the UN panel of experts on DPRK sanctions. So let me give you a couple of examples of what types of questions could be answered using the open source. So, for example, after the media announces that DPRK has tested a new missile and DPRK releases the pictures of the test, can we prove that that test actually happened? Or were the evidence photoshopped? Can we, for example, prove operation of a nuclear reactor using satellite imagery? What can we learn from analyzing vessel movements patterns in specific regions? What insights can be drawn from social media? So all of those questions we can answer or try to answer with a different level of precision by using the open source data. There are multiple types of data that an analyst can work with and draw insights from. Text data, visual data, satellite imagery, ground imagery, videos, ship tracking data, plant tracking data, radio frequencies, and so on. So I want to stop a bit in more detail on the use of satellite imagery that has recently become the most sexy type of open source data, which is increasingly becoming freely and commercially available to the general public. So to give you some visual example of the change in technological capabilities that happened over the past 50 years, here you can see two satellite images of the same location. One was taken in 1960, the other in 2009. Well, I believe the difference is apparent from the very first glance, but let's look in a bit more detail. So the image from 1960, we can only roughly assess the geographical shape of the location, as well as guess that those distinct white lines are probably resembling a runway of the airbase. But on the imagery from 2009, we can see much more detail, and there are much more details for the analyst to assess. In addition to the very clear layout of the runway, we can even see and count individual planes surrounding supporting infrastructure, and many other little details that now we can observe due to a significant technological improvement of satellite imagery collection. Let me give you one more example. So this is one more illustration of the improvement of satellite imagery resolution over time. With as close as 0.25 meter resolution, we can even see the logos on the wings of the plane. But what's important here is that not only did we get a better resolution and precision of the imagery, it also now become commercially available to the general public. So this type of intelligence is no longer exclusive to states. And these developments truly revolutionized the field of open source. This image could be familiar to some of you. This is an image that was tweeted by former President Donald Trump in 2019, when Iran was attempting to launch one of its rockets and the test failed. So President Trump tweeted this image, and then people who are working with satellite imagery were immediately shocked by the high level of detail. And we cannot obtain that level of precision and resolution with the commercially available satellite imagery. What we can have is, for example, on this slide, you can see the satellite image provided by Maxar with a 0.5 meter resolution. So this is as good as the image could get for us, the general public. But is there really a crucial difference? Of course, we can see much more details, but we can definitely get the meaning. You can see the smoke on both images, which would indicate that the test has failed. And even the first announcement in the media that the test has failed was performed by one of our colleagues at CNS, Dave Schmiller, who posted the image with even lower resolution, but that was already enough to make a worldwide breaking news where it was proved that the test that Iran was attempting failed. Another example of what could be achieved with using the satellite imagery. So here you can see the comparison between the optical satellite image on the right and the infrared spectrum on the left. So the property of the infrared spectrum is that is reflected well from the healthy vegetation. And if the vegetation is artificial, then the reflective properties would be different. So you can have a look at the sports field here, which you can see stands out, it's a different color. If we only looked at the visual, the optical satellite imagery, where it appears green, we might assume this is a healthy vegetation. But by using the infrared spectrum, we can know that this is, in fact, the artificial vegetation. This spectrum could be applied by detecting the camouflaged military bases, equipment. That's how this type of analysis of the imagery could be used and applied in the security field. Another type of imagery is the imagery taken during the night, and that's where it's very useful to detect security perimeters of some of the, well, again, military air bases or other sensitive sites that require the security around it. Thermal imagery. Here you see the example of a Yonbyon Nuclear Research Center in DPRK. So through the processing of satellite imagery, you can see the hotspots where the activity is happening. So those red areas on the slide that you can see are indicating the increased activity at radiochemical laboratory, thermal plant, and centrifuge plant in the Yonbyon nuclear complex, which then could prove to us that probably those facilities are in operation and some activity is happening in there. One more example here is the SAR imagery that Alexandra already referenced. This is the latest test that was conducted by DPRK in 2017. So this GIF gives you the idea, well, you can see how the mountain is breathing. So this is basically the comparison between the two satellite images, one before and after the nuclear weapon test, which happened inside that mountain in the tunnel. So some of the land masses were moved by the shock wave after the explosion. So after comparing this two satellite imagery and finding this proof of the effect of the explosion, we know the exact location of the test, and we actually have the proof of the test happening. And even going beyond that, some of the satellite imagery providers can now also offer not only stationary visuals and photos, but also videos, where in almost real time, you can see the personnel movement on the sites of your interest. You'll now also see some vehicle movement. And so you can really observe and identify the operational status of the facility in question. So just to make the final point, why does this all matter? Well, because the asymmetric access to information when the adversarial states lack shared and timely and reliable information is one of the most important risk factors in the security domain. And while intelligence services exist precisely to minimize this information shortfalls, they often cannot share that information with each other. And so such uncertainties are critical risk factors for conflict and escalation. And with this increasing public availability of data from unclassified open sources and rapidly advancing analytical capabilities, civil societies, NGOs, private sector can provide alternative sources for trustworthy information and analysis. And I'll stop right here. Over to you, Nikolai. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronika. Well, I think now everyone can rest assured that almost nothing can be hidden. Yes, throughout your presentation, I was just really thinking about the old kind of days where all this was not only kind of the purview of literally 2, 3, 5, maybe 6 kind of states. Yes, the public had only to hope that something will get leaked out to the media. Yes, now almost anyone can do that. And I myself actually am using satellite imagery in my own projects. So yes, that's really fascinating development. Yes, our next speaker is William Moon, who is the non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington and he's a consultant to the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, also in our parent organization as well, in Monterey, and who also has many years of very important with experience in managing the cooperative threat reduction programs that the United States conducted in the Russian Federation. Yes, and I just wanted to thank him for that important kind of role. Yes, I know how important that was. Yes, I know something about CTR. Yes, I did actually take part, yes, in the very initial consultations about CTR. So yes, that's something very close to my heart. So Bill, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nikolai, and thank you to VCDNP for this wonderful invitation. It's my pleasure to be part of this panel. And let me get my slides right here. There we go. So is that working? Good. Yes, tough presentations to follow, a lot of very interesting information, and I hope this will help bring some of those technologies and thoughts together. What I'd like to present today is an idea and a concept that we've been working on that would enable focusing on US and Russia to exchange warhead data in a step-by-step process. And let me give you sort of a preview of the work that we've been developing on this. So this started out as a study for Belgium, Denmark, Netherlands, Germany, and Sweden. They asked CNS to look at verification of non-strategic nuclear warheads. A lot of interest in the possibility of verifying warheads, especially after the INF treaty has expired and both the US and Russia have withdrawn from it. So they asked us to look at, well, what would be the possibility of being able to verify nuclear warheads? And this is a difficult challenge because previous arms control treaties have focused on limiting delivery systems. There are no direct limits on warheads and no limits on non-strategic warheads. So the challenge is difficult because warheads are small, they're mobile, they're difficult to detect and monitor. And on-site inspection is very intrusive when it would come to warheads. It would raise safety and security concerns. It is not safe or secure to bring electronics or video anywhere near a warhead. Making direct observation of warheads is difficult, especially because they are stored in containers. They're made up of various components, and in many cases cannot be taken out of containers for observation while they're in storage. So we started to think about this problem and how can we design a data exchange methodology that would enable the sides to track the warhead inventories throughout their service life. Simply exchanging data on total quantity would be useful and helpful, but it would not help in a long-term verification regime, and it would not give confidence in the stockpile over time. And to implement a methodology exchanging such data, it needs to be done without revealing sensitive information on design, composition, or performance. Most verification R&D that's been done thus far on warhead verification has focused on the physical attributes of warheads involving design, composition, and performance. And this has been very difficult to reach agreement on how to exchange such information. And a system of data exchange must be done without creating safety or security vulnerabilities and without disrupting warhead operations. So when we started looking at this, we look back at what previous exchanges we have had between the US, Russia, under the CTR agreement and under the mill-to-mill agreements that might help us with this challenge. The Cooperative Threat Reduction Program engaged with Russia from 1992 to 2013 on nuclear security. And in fact, we worked together to develop warhead inventory management systems. The systems used by the DoD and the MOD to track their warheads are called ACOMs and diamonds. And in fact, they're quite similar in their form and function. Our cooperation has enhanced our understanding of how those systems work and how they track warheads. And in fact, the inventory management systems used by both sides track warheads by locations, movements, and transactions such as shipments. So under CTR and under mill-to-mill technical exchanges, turns out Russia and the US have actually exchanged some data on things like warhead storage locations. We've visited locations on both sides. Transport of warheads, disassembly locations have been exchanged, the identification of them. Warhead shipments have been conducted, and information on shipments already conducted were exchanged under the CTR agreement, including component shipments. And we know a lot about procedures used for security checks and inventory management audits. So this is very helpful. The historical data of this kind is not as sensitive as physical attributes of warheads, such as design, composition, of performance. So we thought perhaps this kind of data could be exchanged and might be able to help us to develop a data exchange process. The idea is to use this data to create a unique identifier or passport used to track and identify individual warheads. In other words, a unique or virtual tool to identify warhead transactions. We use the term warhead passport because that's actually how the Russians described to us their inventory management process before we started cooperating on the inventory management systems. They described a process where every warhead would have with it a passport, a paper passport showing every transaction and every place the warhead has been over its lifetime. And when we worked together to automate that data into an inventory management system, we were able to understand exactly what was happening and how they track it. So it was simply automating those paper passports. And that's the system that they used and we have been using, very similar to the Diamond system in the US that's managed by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. So as we looked at this a little bit further, now the historical data on transactions might be shared, but if you look at that, we wouldn't want to share between our countries a complete historical history of the life cycle of a warhead. That would be sharing a lot of sensitive information about how often a warhead needs to be maintained and so forth. So how could we share the data without sharing all of the data? That was the challenge. And here we looked at cryptography as a technology that we might use in order to help solve that problem. And in fact, cryptography can be used to create unique hash codes that represent all of the data in a warhead passport. It can be used like a label, but doesn't contain all of the data. The hash is simply a string of letters generated from a data set. A hash function cannot be reversed to get the original data. It's a representation of that data. No two data sets will yield the same code. So with hash codes, individual warheads lifecycle data can be cryptographically committed to the other side without revealing the amount of detail that would be involved in the total history of the warheads. So under this process then, each country's warhead inventory could be represented by a ledger or simply a listing of warhead passport hash codes that represent each warhead. So here is a depiction of a notional warhead and a warhead passport and what it might look like. I'm not going to go through all of this data. It's simply to show you that the kind of data used to form this block of data would be, the individual blocks are not that sensitive. A date and time in the past, a location, a status, a simple listing of components, perhaps the operation of this transaction, such as a transfer of custody, and escort personnel involved. That would represent the warhead as a passport ID hash. You see a number there. And then every transaction from there could be added to this listing and shared between the sides. So based on using cryptography as an emerging technology, then our notion or a concept for a step-by-step data exchange methodology would first involve a baseline exchange of hash codes, represents the total warhead inventory, and cryptographically, the data contained within the hash codes or within the passports would be committed. That updates would be shared between the sides by committing hash codes representing all the warhead transactions within a specified time frame. Then observing parties could conduct data challenges to the other party requesting to decommit specific items within that total data set in order to gain confidence in the overall data set and confidence in the data that's within the passport and has been committed to the other side. The parties would validate any data that's decommitted by running it through a hash function and ensuring that it produces an identical hash code. Under this process, data is revealed step by step instead of a comprehensive, extensive initial database gathering. This would be a step by step with each challenge revealing more data in order to build confidence on the warhead data and the overall inventory over time without releasing current or operational data. Since the challenges are samples of the overall inventory representing the history of the warhead's life cycle, each decommitment of the data point increases confidence in the overall validity of the ledger. Here's a visualization of the data challenge process that could be used for this exchange. And it shows the host party first derives a hash code from its data entry from its passport. The hash is committed to the observing party through cryptography. The observing party challenges that committed hash. The host party shares that original entry, and then the sides can confirm that that entry is a valid entry. The transaction was a valid transaction by running it through the hash function. And this commitment is immutable. If there was any change in the original data that was committed between these steps, the hash code would be different and you would know that there would be falsified data. And one of the keys to this process is that the challenges can be designed to correlate with NTM, National Technical Means, or other known data points to further increase confidence in the data validity. And this is where the earlier presentations could come in to provide data that could be used to help validate this process and validate a data exchange. So this is a methodology that could be used as a transparency verification and confidence building tool. This is not intended as a comprehensive verification solution. This is intended to validate declared warhead stockpiles conducted in a step-by-step process. And the way we envision such a methodology would be that the US and Russia would conduct joint exercises or demonstrations of the methodology. Could be done initially with notional data to develop the concept further and to support diplomatic discussions or agreements, whether they be arms control or confidence building measures. And CNS has been funded to actually develop a tabletop demonstration where we are going to build electronic passports and do a hardware and software demonstration of this concept so that we could share it with other parties and perhaps consider using it for applications and future negotiations. We look at this process as enabling the sides to build confidence in the data exchange process over time and create a foundation for future verification measures. The process could be applied to an entire inventory at first, or any agreed set of warheads. Could be deployed or non-deployed, strategic, non-strategic, or both. Could be just looking at warheads destined for dismantlement. Whatever the sides through negotiations might agree to initiate this process of exchange. And I think that's the end of my presentation, and look forward to the discussions.
Yeah, I would say that to me, as an arms controller, at least a former arms controller, that's really very, very good news, because warheads have always been perhaps the most challenging aspect of arms control. And I would also like to note that the ability to verify warheads, to track warheads, is really critical. It's central for nuclear disarmament task. How can otherwise you eliminate nuclear weapons if you cannot track them? So thank you very much, all of you. We already have some questions. A few questions came before, prior to the event, and some questions have already arrived during your presentations. Well, and let me start with perhaps the most difficult question. Yes, I myself, I'm not sure how I would answer it. Yes, and that's the question that I think is intended for all three speakers. And how could you actually use all these new tools to bring China into arms control process? Can you create new incentives, or can you do that by demonstrating that, well, whatever China is doing is not a secret anyway? So yes, I actually wonder, how would you assess the impact would be available in emerging technologies is on solving that specific actually the test that is not technical, but it's a policy action task. Who would like to go first? I know it's a very challenging question.
Well, I can go first, since I also started with the presentation. Of course, it's very hard to answer this question, as you just said, but sticking with aerial observation, I would only note that all aerial observation, first of all, due to the law that is well in this area, requires cooperation. So in contrast to, and Veronika might correct me if I'm wrong, to satellite information, as soon as we talk about aerial observation and transparency here, we need to have a cooperative element. So this would not be possible against the will of the Chinese government, and would already presuppose a lot of trust between the partners. That's why it was so hard and took several decades actually to develop such a system between the United States and the Soviet Union, and then of course also their respective allies, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union too. So this took many years to develop, and I would expect the same with China. Nonetheless, there have been some ideas floating around whether it would make sense to have a kind of open skies framework, generally speaking, with Chinese participation. This is not totally abstract or totally out of the question, but as I said, it would take a lot of time. It would necessitate cooperation from China.
So,
okay, just thank you, Alex. Bill.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity, and thank you for the question. It has been a question that we have been thinking a lot about in developing this process. First I'd like to point out that the process that we're looking at in terms of warheads, it relies on looking at life cycle data of a warhead versus performance and physical characteristics. So we think the fact that it does not require intrusive investigation of performance characteristics, not only would Russia perhaps be able to consider such a methodology, but perhaps China as well. Now, a lot of our methodology was based on previous cooperation with Russia under the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. And although it's not as well known, there have been exchanges in cooperative threat reduction with the Chinese as well. In fact, we worked together with them in developing a nuclear security training center just outside of Beijing. However, those exchanges have not been as extensive and not as long lasting or as deep as with Russia. However, such a methodology on warheads, one of the incentives that the Chinese might consider is that such an exchange could provide them better understanding of the composition of both US and Russian stockpiles. This could build confidence because, as we know, the NNSA and State Department in the US has released some data on the total warhead stockpile. And within that data, they also indicated a number of warheads that they consider to be inactive or in reserve. This process would provide greater confidence in that kind of understanding with regard to the stockpile. So instead of looking at, 7,000, perhaps it's really 5,000 active. And so that would be an incentive for them to consider such a data exchange. Would also help them understand the applicability when warheads are assigned to dual capable systems. And when we say a system is not warhead equipped, this process would provide some insight on those claims.
Thank you, Bill. Veronika, you want to join?
Yes, it is indeed a very challenging question, and especially, speaking from my background, working in open source, to marry open source and China would be quite a challenging task. I think we all know about the Great Chinese Firewall, which basically makes Chinese part of the internet separate from the global internet, if I can put it in those simple terms. So the very aspect of doing open source data analysis on the level of individuals and private companies is basically non-existent in China in the way that we understand it. Cooperation on some state level, maybe. I'm not aware of any such initiatives. So I don't know. This is a $1 billion question, and whoever can give an answer to that, well, I would love to hear this.
Yes, thank you, Veronika. One kind of interesting aspect of Bill's both presentation and the answer is he is actually revealing that much more has been done. Many more with exchanges of data and cooperation took place both between the United States and Russia and between the United States and China than the public actually knows. So yes, that's really kind of interesting. Yes, and it's a pity that we don't know more about these kind of things, but at least we begin learning. Yes, Alex, there was a question about that directly relates to open skies. Yes, and that's the possibility of using that data for parties outside the treaty. Yes, although the Open Skies Treaty, of course, only allows sharing of information among parties. Well, the question is whether it's possible to access that information outside the treaty. Yes, and perhaps you might imagine some possible ways within the future in other similar regimes that would make that data more accessible. So not in Ost, but maybe some kind of a future confidence building and transparency regime.
Well, I mean, you are of course right that the images that are taken within the framework of the treaty are limited to the participating states. However, as I said before, over the last decades, the Open Skies capabilities, national capabilities, have been used for other purposes outside of the framework of the treaty. And in these cases, of course, it depends on the state in question that is using these capabilities to make the data and the images available also to other parties. And this has been done in the cases I've been mentioning, not in all of them, but I think in the Haiti case as well. And this is, of course, possible. It's also possible to make these images available to international organizations, to the OSCE, to the United Nations. This, of course, depends on whether there is actually a case for it. So whether there is a kind of cooperation on a certain issue. And the OSCC, the consultative body of the treaty, will also be involved. But the treaty allows this to happen. Generally speaking, I would only say that the images as such do not have such a high, as far as I understand, level of classification as some other intelligence, particularly also satellite images that have been mentioned by Veronika, at a certain level of resolution, of course. So it should be, generally speaking, possible to share these images more widely in a general sense if we are talking about different agreement and different setup beyond the current treaty. I think this would be possible. I think a lot of depends, of course, on the maximum resolution that is allowed within the treaty or within such framework. And there will always be a kind of security transparency trade-off here. And I think that is something, generally speaking, that always pops up when we talk about more transparency. How does this affect actually security of the states? And of course, a publication of such images will be part of that discussion.
Oh, thank you, Alex. There was a question that actually arrived yesterday. So to interrupt, well, truly kind of fascinating arms control and openness kind of security with implications. Nonetheless, I think it's very important to discuss whether the new tools for transparency and verification might be relevant to monitor, yes, and maybe to mitigate climate change. So, well, basically, we're talking about possible use of new technologies for other kind of purposes. That's outside the topic of the seminar. Of course, we talk about verification, confidence building, and transparency. But I think, well, it's quite an important issue for like a lot of people. Well, basically for the entire kind of humankind. So I wonder if you could at least could briefly address that. Alex, you mentioned actually the use of equipment quite recently by Germany to assess the impact of disasters, and maybe all other uses that we might consider here.
Yes, well, as I mentioned, this has been, or the Open Skies capabilities of single nations has been used for such purposes before. At least that would be my perspective. The sensors that is radar and near infrared, actually, that have not been used within the treaty framework are most probably the most interesting for environmental purposes. And in addition to that, new sensors that are right now not part of that treaty, that is non-imaging sensors for air sampling, for sampling of gases in the atmosphere. And I think this could be actually done and has been discussed again for 20-25 years. I think the issue why this has not happened on a multilateral scale is that many states do have adequate facilities civilian facilities and national facilities to do such a monitoring of the environment. And the aircraft they use for such purposes are usually smaller than the open skies aircraft. So I think this all comes down to cost benefits analysis, whether it makes sense to use particularly these kind of capabilities, these kind of aircraft, and what kind of sensors, and how much does it cost to use it in this or that particular case. But I see no principle barrier not to do this. To the contrary, I think this is a way forward to use such regime in a cooperative sense in the future.
Oh, thank you, Alex. Veronika, maybe you could also address that question.
Absolutely. I just wanted to jump in here. Exactly.
Satellites can kind of probably provide some.
Correct. Yes. And I think that's exactly complementary to what Alexander was saying. So with satellite imagery, one could actually see the record of the development and how the climate situation was changing over the long periods of times. Deforestation, the melting of the icing, all of that could be, you know, just visually observed by everyone. And I think recently it was the Google Earth team that they released a series of videos where they basically combined and layered several satellite images of the same area over time, where one could just watch and see how that was changing. And I think that's actually also contributing a lot in terms of raising the public awareness about the importance of the climate change. But also to build on what Alexander was saying in terms of how expensive and difficult it is. So if we move away from just the optical imagery where, okay, the changes are obvious, if we want to analyze the imagery and access all those layers of data that could be collected by sensors on satellites, processing of those is a very technically challenging task. And so we're talking about people who should be processing that imagery, who should not only have expertise in being a climatologist or having expertise, you know, in those environmental issues, but at the same time being very technically savvy to be able to process the imagery. And this is the combination of skills. Which is still very rare. I don't think we have a lot of specialists who've been trained on that, but there is definitely an area of huge potential.
Thank you, Veronika. Now let me shift to Bill. And there is actually a long list of questions to you. Let me try to summarize them. Actually, there have been several questions. Several people were very interested. Well, in knowing, well, all right, you can create these passports, yes, and track the stockpile. How do you know that the initial data or the baseline data that will be used for this type of regime is complete? Well, in fact, it's actually several people who asked that, and I do think that's well, a very important aspect of the proposed mechanism.
Yes, yeah, thank you for that question from all of those who submitted that question. And our approach is a different way to come at that question. Instead of trying to validate and verify a total baseline, a total declaration upfront before you even conduct negotiations, the process and the concept that we're developing would increase your confidence in that baseline, in that exchange over time. So you would not know initially whether it's completely accurate. Rather, over time, as challenges are issued and data are decommitted to each side, your confidence grows slowly in a step-by-step process. And the sides could negotiate then how frequently and how often and how much time in between those challenges. So we're not proposing a whole solution here, but it's a little bit different approach where the initial exchange of data just gets you started, allows the possibility for validation, and it's the challenge process that under step-by-step measures, you gain confidence over time. That's why it fits within the notion of a confidence building measure as opposed to a total verification solution. But that confidence building measure can be used to support a total verification solution down the road.
So basically what you say, if I understand correctly, that even if one party does not provide data that's complete, there is a very good chance that eventually the warhead that was not declared at first will simply pop up during the exchange.
Yes, an undeclared warhead, if it were, any operations or transactions that are detected via open source information, it could be open skies, it could be national technical means, it could be intelligence information. So using that data, the side would develop and design a challenge to look for that evidence and to confirm it. And over time, it would be difficult to hide all transactions that are undeclared. And to hide a large number of undeclared transactions would be not impossible, but it would be extremely difficult. It would mean new routes. It would mean constructing more underground facilities. The measures taken to try to remove any chance of detection would be quite extensive and quite expensive. This is not a perfect solution to verification. Rather, it's a confidence building measure to encourage the sides to share data as we go.
Thank you, Bill. Yes, and one more question to you that actually came from Russia. I was not sure that I wanted to ask you this question, but why not? So the question that came actually from Russia, what's your expectation in plans, if any, to discuss that method with the Russian government?
Yeah, Dima, thank you for that question. I'm happy to answer it. In fact, that is something we've thought a lot about. With Rose Gottmuller and Miles Pomper are leading our study, and they have established for us a conduit for engagement through the National Academy of Sciences. And we have had an initial engagement through that forum to present this to some Russian experts. And based on that initial presentation, I was actually quite pleased to hear that the Russian side used the word potential to describe this methodology. My experience working with the Russians on these sensitive nuclear security issues involving warheads, it usually takes engagement 3 times back and forth before that kind of language is used. So I was very happy to get that initial reaction from some Russian experts. And what we intend to do is develop the demonstration. We've been briefing this to US government experts, the national labs, NNSA, and the plan is to show this demonstration to the State Department and work with them on timing, whether and when to present the concept to the Russians in an official forum. We think that putting it in a physical hardware and software demonstration would be a first step to really visualize the potential of a confidence building measure. And under that, if mill-to-mill were to be reestablished or lab-to-lab, this would be a candidate exercise that could be exchanged under either of those forums as well. So we're hopeful, and we'll do all we can to try and share this concept with the Russians and with our allies.
Thank you, Bill. As always, of course, Alex, I think, will also made it very clear in his presentation. There is a gap between what technology can offer and what states finally agree to. The process of negotiating some of the measures that will be used in our interstate relations is never so easy, but yes, we should actually try to use more to negotiate as many new options and tools as possible. Question to Veronika, and also not an easy question. The question is really about, okay, anyone can know by satellite our imagery. Yes, look at them. But much really depends on how you interpret it. It's on how you work with it. Sometimes actually these algorithms are not public use. They belong to various organizations, might actually be difficult to replicate by others. But more importantly, they can be disputed. So you see an image, but what do you read from it? And we actually know in real life that sometimes our analysis based on open source by non-governmental organizations can be disputed by states. And in fact, instead of stabilizing and improving kind of relations and solving issues, might in fact create more controversies and more conflict. So, so how do you kind of balance these things? We do tend to say that openness is good. Yes, and more actors, both governments and not governments, can access data, the better. But we've already seen, well, quite serious kind of disagreements over interpretation of various data.
Yeah, thank you, Nikolai, for that question. And I believe it was Pavel Podvig who posted it, and this is a really great question. So that's actually back to your opening remarks, Nikolai, when you were saying that today we're talking about the technology that had a positive impact. And I was smiling because I was kind of anticipating a question like this that would say, well, you know, it's not all that one-sided, it's not black and white. And of course, now with this overwhelming amount of data and increasing number of players in the field of OSINT where we interpret the data, we also start to complicate this puzzle. And I'll tell you a couple of anecdotes from my work experience. So a couple of colleagues that work for the international organizations, every time we publish an analysis, well, they'll come back to us and they're like, well, again, so now the member states are reaching out to us and say, like, could you prove that? Is that really true? So now they have to work to verify what we have published. So not only they have to work on the open source themselves, but every time we as an organization create additional open source article, right, publication, whatnot, they have to respond to that as well and basically verify what we have been publishing and like verifying on in our turn. Or to comment on, it is really difficult to interpret some of the imagery. In a couple of publications of mine, I look at the satellite imagery, I think I see one thing, while my colleagues say, well, no, this is completely the other thing. We reach out to technical experts in an attempt to find some ultimate truth. So maybe the people who really have expertise in this can tell us. And then you also have a completely divergent opinions, one expert saying one thing, the other expert saying the other thing. During processing of the imagery, once I was doing it and I was getting the imagery that looked very realistic and the rooftops of the buildings were having orange color, while the other colleague of mine who did the processing of the same satellite imagery, again, got a very realistic view of everything, but the roofs were blue. We're like, so who's right? So this is just to illustrate how difficult it is. And yes, this is a huge challenge. What my organization, the Open Nuclear Network, doing is that we by no means claim that the analysis we're doing is the ultimate truth. The goal is to work with open source, to draw some insights from it, and then to put it on the table and be as transparent as possible about the methodology of how we came to this conclusion and open it to a discussion. So we're not jumping at any final conclusions. We're just saying, well, that's what we're seeing. That's how we came to this conclusion. How about we talk about this? And in that discussion, that's where we're attempting to find, okay, well, what this actually all mean. But yeah, this is a challenge, and the more players are in there, the more opinions you get. But again, maybe this is for good, and this democratizing, when no longer this ultimate authority of deciding what's right and what's wrong lies with just intelligence agencies, but it's open to the broader audience where more people can spot a mistake, fact check you, come in with the additional expertise, will make it more error-proof. The results of this analysis more error-proof. Thank you.
Yes, I actually fully would agree with you. Personally, because at the same time, this information is always sensitive. Yeah, I would say the political consequences of information is always sensitive. So it's always a delicate issue how you translate that data into policy. Do you affect policy in a positive way or a negative way? You can improve things, or you can create more conflict. I think technology here, it opens wonderful possibilities, but also probably requires new algorithms, political, actual procedures, not only to fully utilize the opportunities, but also do that in a positive way. We are nearing the end of the seminar, and there is a question. So yes, I would actually like kind of, well, of course, to give floor to everyone for concluding remarks. But I just wonder whether I could also ask an important question from each one of you to address in your concluding remarks. You know, I think it's really a very central question for all of us. The question is whether a technically perfect, watertight, very reliable verification of transparency system can be in fact agreed to by states. We outside the government, of course, can advocate for that, but it really matters whether states, whether governments can agree to such measures and implement it. So as you make your concluding remarks, please try kind of to look ahead and to assess the possibility of very reliable verifications and whether we can actually rely on states to agree to such verification, or maybe states will in fact try kind of to prevent excessively complete, excessively intrusive verification. Yes, and questions, doubts, concerns will still remain with us. I think it would be right actually to go in reverse order. So Bill, your concluding remarks and your thoughts on.
Yes, thank you, Nikolai, and thank you for the other presentations as well. It's very, very interesting. Helped me understand a little bit more about these issues, and I would like to just make a couple of comments about the issue of confidence building and building transparency. And here I want to go back to the terminology that we've used in our methodology, which is step by step. We see the methodology I presented is more of a tool and more of a new process than it is a solution. And, in my experience working with the Russians on cooperative threat reduction and nuclear security, we found that confidence between parties takes time. It's not usually accomplished through a dramatic negotiation, but it is a process by which each side reveals certain understandings a little by little. And certainly my experience of working with warheads is that it needs to be step by step, and it needs to be a little bit of information at a time so that sides can absorb the information, analyze it, and understand that it is in their best interest to share more information. So I want to emphasize that point, that the slowly increasing transparency and doing it on a reciprocal step-by-step basis helps build confidence over time. And I would say that on the possibility of reliable verification, it's critical, especially if we're talking about something like as sensitive as warhead stockpiles. I think it's absolutely critical to build that confidence first, as opposed to trying to negotiate it without any tools and without a common understanding of why we're doing this and what that transparency, what value that provides to each side under a negotiation. So I'll leave it with that. Those are my my thoughts about building confidence over time.
No, please, Veronika.
Yeah, thank you, Nikolai. So I think what's important to note here is that my field of expertise, the open source, is still a relatively, in the way we understand it today, is still a relatively new field and a gray area. So before we can even start talking about states being comfortable employing some of those tools and techniques or outsourcing some of the verification work to private companies, we have to do a lot of work in terms of educating people in the governments on what this is all about, how does that work, and why they should trust this methodology. Without that, I don't think that could ever be possible. But, and now I would wear a hat of me being an optimist here. Being inside of this field, I think, private companies, NGOs, actually could provide independent assessment of capabilities of, for example, parties to the conflict. And this could really contribute to alleviating the core challenge of this asymmetric information access that I've been talking about in my presentation. NGOs can also offer independent verification complementary to that conducted by states and perform fact-checking to help clarify allegations or disputed incidents. And this could be achieved without having to create new multilateral or bilateral institutions, which would simplify the process. I'm not blinded here. I know the governments may initially not be comfortable with such third-party involvement, but I believe that a proven record of neutral assessments can increase confidence and add value to the neutral non-governmental entities, and that could be possible. I'll stop with that.
Alex, before giving the floor to you, yes, I would like to somewhat complicate your actual task, because there was one question that literally came up 2 minutes ago. Yes, and I wonder whether in your concluding remarks you could also address the question whether it's possible to extend the open skies principles, regimes, rules with all that experience to other kind of regions, especially in the Pacific, and that does involve also the question that's always been on my mind throughout the entire kind of seminar: the impacts of politics. Sometimes domestic politics, the impact of the broader kind of context on verification, transparency kind of regimes, because it's really sad to see the Open Skies Treaty collapsing in front of our eyes. And yes, I wonder if you could address that briefly.
Well, I will try to do my best at least. Well, first of all, I think I can only reiterate what both Bill and Veronika have said, that, well, confidence building, which this is in the name, of course, is a step-by-step process. So it takes a lot of time. And this is also true for the Open Skies Treaty. I mean, after the treaty was signed in '92, for the next 10 years almost, when the treaty was not yet in force, we had more than 400 flights by states trying out how this treaty would actually work. And they learned a lot during this process. And most probably the way the treaty has been working smoothly, rather smoothly over almost 20 years, is also due to this pre-period when it was possible to try out how this would be implemented. And the same, I would suppose, would be true if we transpose this framework to other regions in the world. Again, it would take time and effort to figure out how actually national authorities also would deal with foreign aircraft coming in and taking images, how states would cooperate. And there is, of course, another level to that. You were just mentioning in terms of politics, that within the treaty so far, I think there was a rather good mill-to-mill cooperation. Also, and in particularly between the United States and Russia, but this did not help to prevent both states to withdraw from the treaty. Which I think is all we need to know about the political element here. So there can be a quite a trusting relationship between the militaries in terms of how people actually conduct these overflights, the information you gather, etc. But then the political level will give the directions in terms of what will happen with the treaty as such. And this is, of course, always a problem. There is, I think, another element to this. I will end on this note, since I think Veronika mentioned democratization. And of course, there are two levels to this. One is democratization between state and non-state. And the other one is between states, between more powerful and less powerful states. If you look beyond the great powers, the Open Skies Treaty is a very good example of how actually small and medium-sized states, by the way, including Germany, with limited satellite capabilities, can profit from this treaty and have invested in this treaty, particularly for this reason. This is not true to the same extent, of course, for the United States and even Russia. But when you have more than 30 states, the main issue of the treaty is, well, to democratize the ability to have this data and take these images, which otherwise you would simply not have. So I think that's the most important point of the treaty, the cooperation point, and that's why cooperative aerial observation.
Thank you very much. The time is up. There were plenty of questions. So I tried kind of to relay all of them, but I know that some questions were responded to offline by speakers. So let me thank you once again. We tackled a very important topic here, and I suppose, like with all kind of the cautionary aspects and comments, that's a very positive kind of topic that's looking out into the future and shows that we can actually do things much better than we used to. With new technologies, with enabling states, enabling society, opening new horizons. So thank you very much to all the speakers for exciting presentations, and thank you for the audience for joining us. Yes, and not only listening, but also asking very interesting questions. I would say some very challenging actual questions. Well, in fact, for asking more questions than we had time to tackle here during the seminar. That really shows that the presentations were interesting and good. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nikolai. Thank you, Alexander and Veronika.